After 2014 at the age of 38, Peyton Manning was contemplating retirement. He was still playing at a high level, having just thrown for over 4,700 yards and 39 touchdowns, but Manning was honest with himself and knew that his body was breaking down. The Broncos, with no real successor in place, had to convince Peyton to come back for just one more year. Broncos general manager John Elway was at the forefront of that and ultimately helped convince the future Hall of Fame quarterback to return for an 18th season. The obvious reaction here for Broncos Nation was rejoice, because it extended their Super Bowl window. Manning may have been entering the next season at the age of 39 and a bit on the decline, but who cares? Denver just had a top 3 defense in terms of yards allowed, the offensive line was still top half in the league, and the combination of Demarius and Sanders at wide receivers still remained. There was also a coaching overhaul in the summer of 2015, with Gary Kubiak taking the spot of John Fox. And while Kubiak was a reasonable hire, it would transition Peyton from the more shotgun-heavy formations to an offense that was more under center and run-focused. And while it may have been something different and not what he was accustomed to, being paired with Kubiak was the right thing for Manning at this point in his career. It took more off his plate, he actually gave Peyton off days during summer practices, and just didn't want him to burn out. It was something John Elway approached Peyton about in late 2014 when he noticed Manning being so uptight and not enjoying things like he usually did. And ironically, Elway told Peyton about his first Super Bowl win, where his stats were not that great himself, but he finally realized he didn't have to do it all in order to win. It's not easy for somebody wired the way Peyton is to just accept that, but it was something that the coaches would try to get out of him. By this point, there were whispers about Manning's declining ability, mainly due to how 2014 ended. He dealt with a quad injury the final 3 games, and you could tell he looked diminished. You pile that on with a guy who was now 39 years old and dealing with the lasting effects of his major neck surgeries, and you now have a guy that was described as a quote-unquote walking injury report. And after that quad injury, his numbers did take a hit, even if it was a small sample size. He had 4 interceptions in a game in week 16, looked underwhelming in a blowout win in week 17, and missed a ton of throws, especially deep, in their playoff loss against his former team, the Colts. As for 2015's preseason, it did not look much better. Of course, there was the newness with Kubiak's offense that made things more difficult, but the first team had trouble finding rhythm during preseason action. That translated to week 1, where Denver's offense only scored via field goals and Aqib Talib taking back a pick 6. Manning even threw a pick 6 to Jimmy Smith right before halftime. So technically Denver's offense found the end zone, just not in the way they wanted to. However, they still did get the win, and this ended up being a constant theme throughout the season. In the next 2 games, his numbers were closer to vintage Peyton, as he threw for at least 250 yards and 2 touchdowns in each contest, as Denver got off to a 3-0 start. Now here is where the absurdity of the 2015 Broncos really starts to show. Over the next 6 weeks, Peyton Manning played some of the worst possible football you'll ever see from an NFL quarterback. If I told you that over a 6-game span, he would complete 57% of his passes, was league average in yards per attempt, threw just 4 touchdowns to 14 interceptions, and ran for -2 yards, what would you assume this team's record was? 0-6? Maybe they got lucky and went 1-5, even 2-4 at best? Nope, not even close. Somehow they managed to go 4-2. To no surprise, over that span from weeks 4 through 10, Denver's defense had the most sacks, forced fumbles, and only allowed 18 points per game. There was no question to this point what was the strength of the 2015 Broncos, but the only question was, could the offense do just enough? Dating back to as early as September, everybody knew Manning had declined significantly. It was going to be up to Gary Kubiak and the run game to try and mask his deficiencies. After a 7-0 start, the Broncos dropped their first game of the season, which once again was against Peyton's old team, the Indianapolis Colts. But during that matchup, it was later revealed that Manning had aggravated a plantar fasciitis injury in his right foot, but still managed to play the following week. But letting Manning play in that game is something Gary Kubiak later admitted he regrets, as he clearly did not look right. Kubiak said, "I should not have let him play. He did not go through his normal routine that week. His foot was bothering him." Peyton did say he felt good enough to play through his foot and ribcage injury, but it was an absolute train wreck. An atrocious performance where he completed just 5 of 20 passes and had 4 interceptions. Not even Denver's defense could save them this time. The funny thing about this game was Manning passed Brett Favre as the NFL's all-time leading passer, but it was also arguably the worst outing of his career. For the next 6 games, Peyton Manning was made inactive inactive due to injury. They probably didn't want to say the quiet part out loud, but it could have been for performance too, although he was legitimately injured. But with Denver sitting at 7-2, they at least had the luxury of giving Manning time to heal up and maybe come back to start later in the year. They turned to fourth-year quarterback Brock Osweiler, who had never made an NFL start to that point in his career. To Osweiler's credit though, he did do enough. Denver went 5-2 with him as the starter, and they had some impressive wins like beating Brady and the Patriots in overtime. Coming into the final game of the regular season, Manning was made active for the first time since his 4-interception game back in Week 10. This was actually the one and only game in Peyton Manning's career where he was active but not starting, meaning that Osweiler was given the nod, and even though Kubiak said in early December that it was Peyton Manning's job when he returns, it didn't really turn out that way. But sometimes these situations have a way of working themselves out, and that's exactly what happened. While Denver did clinch a playoff spot in their Week 16 win, they needed to win Week 17 in order to secure the #1 seed in the AFC. A loss meant that they would fall back all the way to the 5th seed, sacrificing home field advantage and not getting that much needed bye week. Osweiler struggled through 2.5 quarters that final week and found himself benched due to a combination of poor performance and an MCL injury that he suffered during the game. Manning saw his first game action in almost 2 months and found himself down 6 points in the third quarter. The offense immediately started producing once Peyton entered the game, leading a quick touchdown drive and scoring points on his first 4 possessions back. The Broncos were able to hold off San Diego's late surge, clinching the first seed and a guaranteed trip to the divisional round. In year 18, Manning put up by far the worst regular season stats of his career. His standard passing stats in 2015 were just outright horrific. In 10 games, he threw 9 touchdowns and a staggering 17 interceptions. He completed just 59% of his passes, his lowest since his rookie season in 1998. His 5.1 interception percentage was the worst of his career, also topping his rookie season where he threw a league most 28 interceptions that year. His 67 passer rating was the worst of his career as well. When you compare 2015's regular season Peyton to the rest of the league out of 36 quarterbacks, here's how it looked. He ranked 32nd in touchdown percentage, trailing names like Johnny Manziel and Blaine Gabbert. In interception percentage, he ranked dead last out of 36, and it was by a pretty wide margin too. In completion rate, Manning ranked 27th out of 36, which I guess wasn't atrocious given the rest of these rankings. In yards per attempt, he ranked 28th. The big plays were still there occasionally, but the deep ball was tough to watch by that point in his career. In adjusted net yards per attempt, he was ranked the worst in the league, trailing guys like Colin Kaepernick and Rams' Nick Foles. In passer rating, he was tied for dead last with Ryan Mallett, who only started 6 games that year for 2 different teams. And after all that, his 7-2 record that season ranked him 3rd in terms of winning percentage, only trailing Cam Newton and Carson Palmer. So yeah, Denver escaping that season with the 1 seed was nothing short of a miracle. Even entering the divisional round, the odds were still stacked against Denver to win the whole thing. Out of the 8 teams remaining, the betting odds had them as the 5th most likely team to win the Super Bowl. And given their poor play at the most important position, it was hard to argue against it. Defensively during the regular season, this Denver team ranked #1 against the run, #1 in yards allowed, #1 in yards per play, #1 in passing yards allowed, #1 in quarterback hits, and to no surprise, #1 in sacks. They were historically good on that side of the ball. The only question entering January was, could the offense do just enough to squeak by? 10 days before the divisional round, Gary Kubiak announced it would be Peyton Manning starting in the playoffs. The Brock Osweiler injury wasn't serious enough to hold him out, as he was now the quarterback too but would still be active. And to the credit of both Peyton and Brock, they each handled the situation like true professionals. It was always a team-first mindset based on their quotes, even for the guy that was relegated to the bench. Denver drew the 11-win Steelers as their divisional round opponent, but they were still favored to win by a touchdown in most places. It wasn't the best start, and Denver certainly had their miscues early, but thanks to Brandon McManus and a key defensive turnover, they stayed in the game. Manning had a pivotal 31-yard completion to Benny Fowler in what resulted in a 13-play drive that lasted over 6 minutes and gave the Broncos a 7-point lead. And as usual that season, when Denver's defense needed to make a play, they did. Von Miller and DeMarcus Ware got to Roethlisberger on 4th and 5, sending the Broncos to the AFC Championship game. For Manning, his performance was not that bad and would have looked a lot better if not for some receiver drops. With a Super Bowl appearance on the line, Denver had to get past the 12-win Patriots. It wasn't even the first meeting at Denver that season for these teams, as CJ Anderson walked them off in overtime almost 2 months prior while Osweiler was still starting. However, New England was still favored to win despite the fact Denver was now 9-2 in games where Peyton Manning was playing. The Broncos defense was unreal in this game. They sacked Brady 4 times, Von Miller had this awesome interception where he outsmarted the GOAT, and Darian Stewart got him as well right before halftime. And to his credit, it was another good performance from Peyton Manning, making it 2 games in a row now. He even ran for a first down on 3rd and 10, even though it was tough to watch, but he still got it done. You had 39-year-old Peyton Manning and 33-year-old Owen Daniels going crazy in that game. 2 guys that were playing in their final season. It kind of reminds me of that unction meme. And although the Bronco offense had a decent outing, it was rightfully the defense that was the story of that game. Von Miller was unblockable, and their 4th and 1 stop in the red zone with 6 minutes to go was a momentum killer for the Patriots. They'd get another 4th down stop in the red zone a few minutes later, and of course the failed 2-point conversion which ultimately won them the game. Offensively, Denver couldn't get a single first down for the final 11 minutes. Their 4th quarter offense was brutal. It was as if this Peyton-led offense had hit its ceiling, and the defense now had to hold off Tom Brady for almost an entire quarter, and somehow they did. This really was an incredible game looking back. I forgot how many suspenseful moments there were, and how improbable some of these late Brady to Gronk throws actually were. The stage was set for Super Bowl 50. While he wouldn't publicly admit it, just about everybody knew this was Peyton's final game. Even during media week, he acknowledged that his arm was not the same as it used to be, which is something he never said out loud. The only thing standing between Peyton and a second Super Bowl ring was MVP Cam Newton and the 15-win Carolina Panthers. Carolina was an absolute juggernaut that season, and was rightfully favored to win. And while the first 2 playoff games in 2015 went well for Peyton Manning, it didn't really carry over to the Super Bowl. The bad news was Peyton had 2 turnovers and the Broncos offense only put up 17 points. The good news was Carolina had doubled their turnovers with 4, and of course scored a defensive touchdown thanks to Von Miller and Malik Jackson. And there was a key Jordan Norwood 61-yard punt return, which started that Broncos possession in the red zone, so that definitely helped too. Despite Peyton only throwing for 141 yards, throwing a boneheaded interception, losing a fumble, and completing just 56% of his passes, it was enough for Denver to win Super Bowl 50. A classic ride off into the sunset moment for the then future Hall of Fame quarterback. Alright, so we went over how bad Peyton was in the regular season, but how bad is it including the playoffs, and historically against other Super Bowl winners, and Super Bowl appearances? Well, in terms of Super Bowls, Manning had the worst passing season since Vince Ferragamo in 1979. And if you go by adjusted net yards per attempt from the season of which it happened, Manning had the 2nd worst numbers, only trailing Ferragamo yet again. This SB Nation chart gives us a look at some of the worst statistical quarterbacks to make the Super Bowl as a starter. Ironically, everyone on here aside from Ferragamo and Woodley came away victorious. Now, before we even digest this, it just has to be said it's tough to compare these eras. Everyone on here besides Peyton made their appearance before 1982. Peyton Manning was 6 years old at that time, for reference. Obviously, the NFL has changed a lot from that time period. Even from 2015 to present day, it's a different game. So keep that in mind. But if we're just going off of stats, Manning is not the worst quarterback to make or win a Super Bowl. He was really bad, no doubt, but Terry Bradshaw winning with a 55 passer rating while completing just 45% of his passes is madness. That just wouldn't happen today. I don't care how good your team is elsewhere. Now, how does Peyton fare against other recent examples like Rex Grossman or Trent Dilfer? Those guys he was worse than during their Super Bowl seasons, which says a lot, I know. But if we're only going off of Super Bowl performances, Peyton was better than Grossman, who ironically faced Manning that year back in 2006. But to be honest, Trent Dilfer in 2000 had better stats in the Super Bowl than 2015 Peyton Manning. It probably feels like I've been crapping on Peyton for the entire video thus far, so let me be fair. He definitely deserved more than one Super Bowl throughout his career. There were plenty of other times during his 17 seasons where his defense let him down. So to be on the other side of it for once was just good karma, in my opinion. The guy was also 39 freaking years old. I know it's somewhat normalized these days with certain quarterbacks playing into their 40s, but that is still well beyond the average retirement age, especially for a guy that just went through 4 neck procedures in his mid-30s. It had got to the point where Peyton had nerve damage on his right hand and caused numbness in his fingertips, and that would especially affect him during the colder weather games. games. His arm was also completely cooked by the time 2015 came around. Once again, the deep passing numbers that season weren't too bad, but the eye test will tell you, and so will Peyton during his media day, that his arm was diminished. It's pretty annoying when your entire profession depends on using your right hand and your right arm. And I will say, for those 7 weeks where he was able to sit out and get healthy, that was most likely the difference between the Broncos winning the Super Bowl and not winning the Super Bowl. And it wasn't like he was just sitting on his ass for 7 weeks doing nothing. It was getting up super early, countless hours of rehab, throwing sessions with practice squad guys, and all while trying not to be a distraction to the rest of the team. And in Peyton's own words, the 2015 Broncos do not win that championship without Brock Osweiler. Sure, Peyton was outright bad that season, there's no doubt, but as this article on the Broncos website implies, Manning's leadership, experience, and ability to make timely plays was precisely what the Broncos needed to make their run to a title. He was really the heart and soul of that team, and there's no better example of that than the final regular season game versus San Diego, where Peyton came in and the whole vibe changed. In the words of Gary Kubiak, they were begging for him to come back. You could see it in the first half and how we were playing against San Diego in week 17. They wanted his presence, they wanted his leadership, they wanted him back on that field. Year 18 for number 18 wasn't perfect, far from it, but it did have the perfect ending. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to leave a like and subscribe for more NFL content like this, and I will talk to you guys next time.